There are those who believe that life here began out there, far across the universe, with tribes of humans who may have been the forefathers of the Egyptians, or the Toltecs, or the Mayans. Some believe that there may yet be brothers of man who even now fight to survive somewhere beyond the heavens.
Hi everyone, welcome once again to Geek Fest Rants. My name is Carlos Perron, and joining me here today is James. Say hello, James.
Hi everybody.
Today's subject is Battlestar Galactica. Now, Battlestar Galactica could lead in many directions. It could lead into the Sci-Fi Channel, it could lead into the original, it could lead into possible future films, toys, this and that, but let's narrow it down right now. Let's start in the beginning. The TV show that most of us have seen on TV, some of us in reruns, originated back in the late 70s, and there was a reason why that show was basically allowed to be put on the air. Normally, science fiction in the 70s, especially big budget science fiction, was somewhat of a no-no.
It didn't even exist?
Yeah, it was just, nobody thought there was an audience for it and nobody wanted to invest money on it. But because of a little film called Star Wars, things changed a little in the late 70s that allowed these type of shows to come up. Now, James, tell us a little bit about why exactly, what the heck does Star Wars have to do with Battlestar Galactica?
Well, I think of this TV series fondly. A lot of people look back on it, they don't like it, they goof on it. I have always liked it, and I could watch it now and still like it. Now, sometimes things seem a little dated, especially since we've got such modern technology in terms of what we see on TV and in the movies. But after Star Wars, everything changed, like we've been saying on all these podcasts, and Universal and ABC wanted a Star Wars of their own. So Glenn Larson, who may or may not be above coming up with an idea that may not be his own, had this story, and he did have it around the same time and maybe even before Star Wars, so it's hard to say that he stole it. It certainly made it easier to get his ideas across in this format.
Right, he wasn't a newbie to Hollywood.
No,
he was
this is a guy who's got a lot of experience and knows the television industry and knows how to play trends. I mean, it's no surprise that he's involved still in television. Anyway, so for this fall season of 1978, ABC wants their own Star Wars on the air, and they're not afraid to spend money, to the point where they even hired John Dykstra, who may or may not have used some of ILM's equipment to get this show on the air.
Which we'll talk about this a little later.
So anyway, on September 17th, 1978, a 3-hour premiere of the Battlestar Galactica movie. Sadly for me, I went to my first Yankee game ever against the Boston Red Sox that day, and I missed the opening of the first episode, so it took me a couple years to actually watch that first episode, which I had to see in a movie theater. But I digress.
Yeah, because for some bizarre reason, obviously I didn't see this when it first came out live because I wasn't in this country yet. But for some bizarre reason, I have memories of maybe seeing it in the theater. Well, not only this, but Buck Rogers.
Yeah, well, here's how they did it. And Buck Rogers, another Glenn Larson production, and which eventually became a TV show. This was created as a TV vehicle for ABC. But in Canada and other countries in Europe, they released it as a movie, which was actually a smart thing to do.
They took a couple of episodes, right?
No, they took the main pilot
movie,
and they shortened it a little bit here and there, and to make it fit for a 2-hour format, because it was probably more like a 2.5 hour, 2 hours and 20 minutes because of commercials, things like that. So it wasn't so hard for them to do. But then they added this gimmick they had back in the late 70s. I think they did this with the Charlton Heston movie Earthquake, something called Sense Around. And it was some type of process that there were big subwoofers in the theater or something. It would make it when there was rumblings.
And hire a whole bunch of teenagers to shake the seats?
It would make you feel like you were involved more in the film.
Here's
like,
a can of beans. Here, enjoy the film.
Sense Around, It's like Smellorama from the 50s.
I thought that's what you meant. I thought you said Smell-O-Vision.
Anyway, so I didn't see it in any of that, but I did see it as a theatrical release a couple years later, and I actually liked it in the theater. It does hold up. But besides all that, this was a big deal. This was really promoted. This was a really big thing. And you know what? It's got enough entertainment in it that it holds up on its own. Take Star Wars out of the equation. I think you could still enjoy this if you didn't know, if you came from a foreign country perhaps, and the first thing you saw was this rather than Star Wars. You know, it's a little lighter. It's a little cheesier in some. It's television. It's the 70s, as we've talked about a number of times.
But it had movie quality special effects.
It had movie quality special effects.
Some big location sets, you know. It had some of that, not all of it.
I just think this wasn't a bad thing. And then when it became a series, you know, it continued as a series, they tried to be ambitious. They managed to go to an ice world. Very interesting that came up. They had various guest stars that were interesting, and they had a bad guy who initially was killed.
That's right.
And they thought enough of it to bring him back for the series, and they re-edited it how, instead of him dying, they re-edited it so it looked like, you know, he was spared. And he actually was a very effective bad guy.
Yeah.
A little over the top, a little bit of a ham.
Even though it made no sense, why would this bad guy be allowed to be a bad guy?
Yeah.
Not only after they killed him, but it's just you have to go with it. You just have to go with it, and you enjoy it.
It's TV. It's make-believe.
Now, let's do a little bit of a recap of the arc, of the story, of as much as we got from it, because the show only lasted one season.
That's right.
And I'm sure it wanted to continue story-wise, but in that season, there were some major plot points that were given to us that have carried on in its future incarnations.
Yeah. So this is a story of people on 12 various planets representing the Zodiac as we know it, but also representing the different races that we know. Each planet would represent some of our different races, but the Capricorns were the main planet, kind of the most Earth-like planet.
Right.
And they're protected. These colonies are protected by battle stars, which are basically aircraft carrier / battleships in space.
There's also a lot of little hints, not only of, like, for example, the astrological signs and the symbols, but like the Egyptian civilization. You see symbols and things and that
and
look
a lot of the early Earth civilizations that in our real history were tied into this, and
they tell you that in the opening of the show. They tell you,
and it's not as far fetched when you think about it, where we eventually wind up, how this works out. And I'm actually impressed that they were thinking of it this way.
What I'm saying is that the opening of the show kind of gives it away a little bit about, they're telling you, some people think that Earth came from the descendants of
People
the Mayans,
from space,
the
exactly.
Egyptians, from other worlds. So they're kind of telling you from the beginning already, listen, this is what we're kind of hinting at.
So it's very ambitious, and it's not just some flash in the pan science fiction. They had a plan, pardon the pun, the producers, that is, and assuming the show went more than one season, maybe they would have, gotten to where we eventually got with the later series. I have my doubts, based on some of Glenn Larson's productions, that this would have really held up over that period of time, besides the fact that it's prohibitive costs.
Plus, you also get the feeling, at least I do, that at a certain point in the lifeline of this series, they realize they were in trouble. And it looks like they try to kind of like speed it up. Let's get to the big finale maybe sooner than expected, because they kind of knew they were in a little bit of trouble.
Yeah, there was talk. Ratings weren't as high. It kept getting preempted. Even the premiere episode was preempted by the Israeli-Egypt Accords in 1978 with President Carter. So it was on a Sunday night, and that's a bad time between sports and world events and
once
things.
Again, pre-DVR.
Yeah. So if you're not home on a Sunday night because you're at a Yankee game, you missed another episode.
So let's go back to what is the arc of the show. You have these people from another planet living in these colonies, and these battle stars are there to protect them.
So it's a militaristic type environment because it's considered a warship, but it's a war that's been going on for many, many years.
And they're at a peace treaty.
And a peace treaty is about to occur thanks to one character named Boltar. But sadly, Boltar has his own agenda, and it's really a sneak attack, kind of like the Pearl Harbor attack.
Right.
And the fleet is destroyed, the planets are destroyed, and there's one Battlestar and some other ships available to take the survivors, anywhere from tens of thousands to
they
maybe
pick up whatever survivors are in Caprica, which is the main planet,
and they go off, and they're going to look for in this world the mythical planet of Earth. And there's a whole bunch of exposition on how they have to get that. They have to get through some Cylon attacks. It's really a lot of story for a TV show, but it worked. like I said, I was a kid, so it made it easier to accept a lot of nonsense.
Tell us about some of the characters.
Well, the main characters are Adama, that's Lauren Green. He was very well known as Ben Cartwright for almost 20 years up to that point. So he's a very popular actor. Apollo is his son, and that's Richard Hatch. His friend, who is I guess a Han Solo type, was Starbuck, a ladies' man, good pilot,
gambler,
fun guy.
Yeah.
Adama also had a daughter in this version named Athena. And there's some various other characters that, they wound up being, decent people. Some of them...
You being a soap opera fan.
I'm a big soap opera fan, and in later years, Rick Springfield appeared on General Hospital, but here he played Adama's other son, who sadly died in the first 10 minutes.
Jesse's girl, right? That's his name?
That's right. His name was Zach. And sadly, he died in the first 5-10 minutes of this TV movie.
But he made a long-time impression on a lot of people.
A surprise is a woman named Jane Seymour, who you may or may not know from the James Bond movie Live and Let Die, and later Dr. Quinn, Medicine Woman. But she was a very pretty woman, and she was, a big get for this show.
Yeah.
And she played a love interest for Apollo.
She's still around, and she still looks pretty good for her age.
Yeah, I've met her, and I'm actually very, very pleased to say she still looked very good.
Jeez, put your pants back on.
But later on, as the series progressed, there were some guest star surprises. And the most notable would be Lloyd Bridges. And fans tend to like that story arc because it was a two-parter.
He's the captain of the Pegasus.
He's the captain of the Pegasus. And they find another surviving Battlestar. But in this case, instead of protecting a fleet of ragtags, as they called it, he was still on a war footing, and he would make attacks on the Cylon bases, steal fuel, steal weapons, parts, whatever.
Yeah.
So when the two commanders met, it formed a bit of a loggerhead because Adama wanted to get some supplies and escape. Lloyd Bridges' character of Kane wanted to attack head-on with two Battlestars and try to finish them off. It just made for good TV, and a good cheesy TV. But as the series went on, it was obvious it became a little expensive.
But let me add another memorable character. There was the dog that was actually a chimp. Daggett?
Muffy. Muffy the Daggett.
The Daggett. He's a Daggett.
He was actually a chimp inside a Daggett costume.
But it's supposed to be a robotic dog.
A robotic dog,
because
the real dog died.
The kid's, what was the kid's name?
Boxy.
Boxer.
Boxy.
Boxy.
Boxy's dog died in the attack, and, why not? They had a robotic dog. And that was the R2-D2 of the show.
And he's the kid of the show. Every show has to have a kid.
Yeah, the cute
the
cute fuzzy-haired kid, or whatever, but he wasn't that cute. Later, as the series progressed, another guest star, who was big in my world because the TV show Emergency had recently been canceled, was Randolph Mantooth. And he played a character on a planet that the Galacticans thought was Earth, but it turned out it wasn't, and it was a little offshoot of some other, another war going on on a more Earth-like planet.
Well, one of the staples of the show was that, as they progress towards where they're going, they visit these different places that they've either they've seen before, like they're familiar with some of these planets with really exotic alien-looking people. And I guess sometimes they visit places they've never been to before. Because you figure if they're heading in a certain direction that they've never been to before, at some point you got to run out of familiar looking places. But let's hit a little bit about the bad guys, because the bad guys are a very important part of the show, especially when you add Baltar. At a certain point, as you said, they re-edited him so that he lives and becomes a bad guy.
Well, at this point, the bad guys are called Cylons, and they're basically a robotic army who are the descendants, in a way, of a reptilian race. Now, we don't know anything about that. We only know this because Richard Hatch's character explains to Boxy who they are and where they came from.
But they never showed them to us, right?
They never showed them. We don't really know anything else about them, except now all that's left is this robot population, almost like the Borg in Star Trek.
But now these robots, to us, and obviously for production purposes, they all look the same, with the red eye back and forth, kind of like Kit. But we also have another robot we see, which is the guy who's between...
Well, that's Lucifer.
Lucifer between...
Yeah, there's different hierarchies of robots, of cybernetic beings. The Imperious Leader, as he's called, is a purplish magenta looking character.
And it's always in the shade.
Almost he looks like he has some sort of 70s afro.
Is he supposed to be a creature or a robot?
Well, I think he's supposed to be a robot because there are several of him as the series progresses.
I remember the action figure,
Yeah,
but I never remember seeing him in that much detail.
Yeah, you do get to see him at times, certain episodes, especially the Kane episodes, the Pegasus episodes. You get a better look at him. So I think he is another hierarchy of robot. Then there's the Lucifer types. It's almost like their brains are exposed to a point.
Yep.
And one of them is played by Jonathan Harris from Lost in Space, Dr. Smith. Oh dear,
oh dear, God.
Will Robinson.
Wow.
Yes, so he's a sci-fi veteran. And then there's the regular Cylons that we know. Some of the gold series, which would be more of the commanders, and then the silvers are the
right, but
sentries.
it's the same body, just different color.
Yeah. And, you see these different characters as the series progresses.
And they're these slow-moving, robotic type.
Yeah, it's amazing that it was that hard to fight them, in hindsight, because they were really lumbering.
Right. I guess it's just the mass.
Yeah,
of them.
there were
There's
so many of them, I think
that
they overrun you. So as the series progresses, later on we have some cheesy episodes with Fred Astaire as potentially Starbuck's father, but we know he's kind of like a charlatan. Mm-hmm. But then they give you a little hint that maybe he wasn't, and it was just a coincidence.
We also get a prison ship.
Yeah, there was a lot of things going on, and they kept it pretty honest in the way they interacted as the series went on. But by the end, the biggest surprise was at the very end, the very last episode, we see the moon landing, as if that's a hint they're getting closer to Earth. But then that was it. The series was canceled. And they never got the opportunity to wrap anything up.
Right, but they also, before reaching the very, very end, they went into this whole thing about the ship of lights and certain characters disappearing.
The show had a bit of a metaphysical
and it was like,
aspect,
whoa,
almost like the ship of light was
trippy.
heaven, like heaven,
Yeah,
or godlike beings. In fact, later on, they had a battle with somebody who was supposed to be devil-like, and then the ship of lights. So there was a lot of elements going on. And, it wasn't too much to follow. I don't recall having any problem following it, but if you dissect it, they were very ambitious in what they wanted to do. They just ran out of time and money. And then this show was canceled. And I was actually very disappointed, but then that was it for a year.
Well, this is one of those moments where we've been through before in our little shows where somebody decides, hey, we can have a little spin-off, little different thing come out of this.
We have the models, we have the sets.
We can rebuild it.
Except we don't have the money, and we don't want to spend any more money.
And so we don't have most of the stars.
Let's see how we can do this on the cheap.
Ooh.
And what they came up with at the time
Ouch.
was bad then, it's bad now. And it's going to always be bad. And it was called Galactica 1980. And the premise of this is the Galactica finds Earth. And that's actually a good premise. And it could have been great if they had even just made it as a TV movie and reassembled some of the cast. But no, they kept Lauren Green as Adama, but they put him a beard. They kept Boomer, which was Herb Jefferson Jr., and they kept the basic look of the sets and the ships. But for some reason, they felt the need to hire Robbie Rist, who was Cousin Oliver, and never mentioned as a character before as this Dr. Z. He was an all-knowing, omniscient kind of character who was helping guide them to Earth. And then they considered Boxey now had grown up, and his pal was Dylan. So it was Troy, Boxey's adult name, and Dylan were the Starbuck and Apollo of this show. And Troy was Kent McCord from Adam 12.
Can I say 2 words? Flying motorcycles?
Flying motorcycles. And even they wouldn't have been as bad, except it just looked bad. The effects were awful. The effects were done by apprentices, it looks like, of the school or something, because it just looks, the matte paintings,
the blue screen, awful.
Everything looks bad. The only thing that actually could be considered exciting is when L.A. is attacked by the Cylons in a what might happen if the Cylons follow us to Earth. And that was even a ripoff of a sci-fi movie, The War of the Worlds, I think, or something from the 60s. And they just basically superimposed Cylon ships blowing things up. So it was bad. And it only got worse. It lasted 8 episodes, and then it was canceled mercifully because the only thing that good that came out of it, they rehired Dirk Benedict for 1 episode, the final episode, and it's like, what happened to Starbuck? And basically, Starbuck crash landed on a planet, and he was responsible for saving Dr. Z and sending him to the fleet, sacrificing himself. So in that respect, we got to see what happened with Starbuck, but the rest of it was just really, really bad. And then that was it. Battlestar Galactica was gone. There was no thought. There was no hope. I mean, years later.
Well, hold on a second. while the show was somewhat hot, very briefly, they did put out some merchandise.
Yeah, well,
because
this is the Star Wars era.
We're only dealing with 1 year, and
Yeah.
they were able to do it quickly enough.
Well, the problem is if you weren't Kenner, you didn't make good toys in the late 70s. And Star Wars toys were the best at that time. That was the new direction. Well, Mattel put out Battlestar Galactica toys, but they were really inferior compared to the Star Wars toys. They were just passable likenesses for the characters.
What sizes are we talking about?
We're talking 3 3/4 again. They also made large size ones, but they were really based on production art rather than the actual show. If you look at the Adama, it looks like the production art of Adama. If you look at the Starbuck or whoever, it just looks like a colonial warrior. I don't even think they call him Starbuck in the large size one. And there's a large size Cylon, which that one is actually pretty good. But of the smaller ones, there were originally 6, and then they put out a few other ones. And it turned out that it was just like the head's detail. They didn't even paint in the eyes. There were various things wrong with it. Okay, well, you can live with that. You can just say that's no big deal. But then they made ships. But instead of making ships like the Viper and the Cylon Raider that these figures could interact with like they did with the Star Wars toys, they made these a completely different scale. So the figures wound up being the size of maybe a $50 silver dollar in height. And the ships, while they were just barely recognizable, they made ships that didn't even exist in the no, they were about the size of maybe your hand from the wrist to your middle finger.
Right, but I'm saying for them to be action figure accurate, they should have been about,
they should have been the size of an X-Wing or a land speed or something like that.
Even though those are not to scale.
No,
to
but that would have
with.
been passable.
But it's a little better.
The Cylon Raider was probably the best of them. It was at least gray, and it kind of looked like a Cylon Raider.
At least they had the right color.
The Viper had the shape of a Viper, but it was kind of cheesy. And then they made these 2 or 3 other toys. One was called the Colonial Scarab. One was called a Colonial Probe. The thing is, they had this feature on them allowing a rocket to be fired out. Now, I can't prove any of this, but the legend that when I was a kid was this rocket shot into a kid's throat and made him choke possibly to death. Now, it was a very dangerous toy, and I recall my mother taking away these rockets from my brother. I kept my stash, and I still have them because I collect toys. But the offshoot of this, the unintended consequence is it affected Boba Fett, one of the most beloved characters in all of toy collecting history.
On its first time being out there.
When Boba Fett was unveiled as a toy after the Star Wars Holiday Special, he was going to be released with a rocket-firing backpack. Well, it turns out, I guess as a result of this, it caused such a furor, and they had to redesign the Boba Fett figure slightly to the point where there was no more launching rocket, and what was left was glued in, basically. Now, we do know this existed because prototypes exist. It's rumored that there were some slipped out and things like that. There were 3 or something like that prototypes. Those are established. They were unpainted. They worked, but some of them are slipped into the hands of collectors. And a legitimate real Boba Fett launching from that era.
I did hear the same story. It wasn't so much that the Boba Fett toy hurt somebody, is that they were afraid of what happened with this apparent Battlestar Galactica toy. They were afraid the same thing might happen, so they said, screw it, let's just glue it down so we don't have that problem.
They were early enough along that none had been, finalized. And then the Boba Fett we got is the Boba Fett everybody knows, and years later, as a gift to fans, as a mail away and as a treat to fans in 2010, it was released to fans as if it was supposed to be the 1979 release.
And now we can all choke ourselves with it. But now, it's funny, the connection with Star Wars with this show...
It doesn't end there.
It extends to even more things that the shows were tied. And you mentioned earlier that a lot of the special effects people from Star Wars who were in the meantime waiting for Empire to get ready to start, they were apparently allowed, or some agreement was made where they could use the facilities and the equipment and some of the people to kind of freelance their work to other projects in the meantime while they're waiting for Empire to rev up. And something apparently happened in between this time with Dykstra.
Yeah, what the company that we know as ILM created with Star Wars revolutionized special effects, especially in movies and television for science fiction. And Lucas had this organization set up and this new equipment that money was spent on, but he didn't quite have a sequel ready. So Dykstra made a deal with the Glenn Larson people and ABC, and they created the effects for Battlestar Galactica.
Because they needed a lot of stock effects.
And they're very similar in style and look to what we see in Star Wars. The fast-moving ships, the laser battles, the multiple layers of effects.
Right, the traveling mats, the animated laser beams, all that stuff.
So that's what makes Battlestar much better than it probably should be.
Right.
But at the same time, it offended George Lucas because he felt this is his proprietary stuff that they're now using on something that he may have actually wanted to touch upon.
Not only the technology, but apparently they were also miffed a little bit about some of the storylines.
Well, secrets were harder to keep back. And they're actually, secrets have never been easy to keep. But this was such a huge thing, Star Wars, that people didn't realize what a small community it was. So when George Lucas started talking about how, hey, okay, we're going to go to a snow planet. Well, it was a year or two away at that point for The Empire Strikes Back. But for Battlestar Galactica, they immediately found a way to create a 2-part episode involving a snow planet. Now, it's completely different. It has nothing to do, one has nothing to do with the other, but it's just too much of a coincidence, and I'm sure it's true. And that happens all the time. If one movie is making an animated movie about ants, it seems like another company makes an animated. If you're making a movie about gladiators, a TV movie will show up about gladiators somehow.
Well,
it's just the way things work.
This apparently resulted in eventually a lawsuit between studios suing each other for different reasons.
20th Century Fox sued Universal, saying that they stole ideas. So basically, Universal countersued, and, after a little acrimony, I don't really know how it ended, but I think they basically settled or were dismissed. Ways. Yeah, nothing came of it. And both sides may have had a point. Larson said he actually created this in the late 60s as Adam's Ark. Lucas said, well, he had plans to do this, this, and this. And it turns out they somehow did it before him. And, the rest is history. There's really nothing would come of it anyway. They aired it. I mean, other than maybe a few bucks passing hands, what could really have come of it? They're two totally different stories going in totally different directions, but I can see as a creator how I'd have been upset if I was George Lucas. I have this big hit, but I can also see how, hey, look, this is the business. And, it's not the same exact story,
The only other Star Wars connection I can think of right now is the fact that Ralph McQuarrie also did all the conceptual artwork for a lot of the Battlestar Galactica vehicles and sets and stuff like that.
And so I consider it a success because I really still like it. If I had to turn it on today and pick an episode to watch, it might not be great, but I think I'd have a good time watching it. And I think people should check it out.
It's definitely a worthwhile, legitimate addition to sci-fi on television. I mean, in the realm of sci-fi, you don't see a lot of stuff. I mean, you see stuff here and there, but as far as most sci-fi shows go, especially in the 70s and let's say even early 80s, this one held up pretty well in terms of it was legitimate. You watch it today and it doesn't hold up as much, but it holds up a lot better than some of these other shows we've seen and we talked about.
The show went into syndication for a few years in the 80s, but after Galactica 1980, it was basically done. They re-edited certain of the episodes into mini-movies. Some of them showed up on pay channels. Some of them showed up in other countries because there were enough episodes that they could mix and match and try to make something of it. But once it was done, it was basically done. Fans had hoped something would come of it, but for the foreseeable future of the 80s, it was basically over.
Yeah, that brought about the end of Battlestar Galactica. Other sci-fi shows popped up, as we mentioned earlier, Buck Rogers and some other shows, by the same creator even. But that was the end of Galactica until a little later, a couple of dozen years later,
90s.
It all started bubbling up again. Some merchandise would be released here and there, some books, comics, people try to keep it alive in different formats, and nothing really took off until what happened later, which we were going to talk about on a future episode. So this brings us to the end of our little original Battlestar Galactica.
It's the end of this episode, but there's more to come.
There's more to come. So please tune again pretty soon when you can listen to the second, I don't want to call it a part 2 because this Galactica thing seems to be an ongoing thing, but it'll be the next chapter of the Galactica saga, if you will. On behalf of James and myself, Carlos Perron, I'd like to thank you guys for listening to and hope to see you here next time on Geek Fest Rants. Bye-bye.
It's the largest task force I've seen since the destruction of Caprica.
What is it? What do they got?
We're not certain. But from the size of that phalanx of attack bombers, they have 3 base ships moving in on us.
Well, you were right. I was wrong. The fleet would have been defenseless now if we had attacked their base.
Well, right now, I need you and your tactical wizardry. They didn't use more than 3 base ships when they wiped out our entire fleet at Caprica.
Yes, but surprise was on their side at Caprica. This time, it might be on our side.
Pull out the Pegasus.
Exactly. It's on the far side of our fleet, so I doubt if it's on their scanners yet. I'll bring it around and squeeze them in between us.
Don't take too long to be in position.
Well, if you don't mind my burning up half my fuel, I'll see if I can bring it up to light speed.
Do I have a choice?
No.
Be there when we need you.
I'll be there.
Commander, 25 microns in closing.
Stand by to attack. This is going to be a classic defeat. Spoken of throughout the star system for 1,000 yards.
Launch fighters.
Stop.